Chapter 12, Fungi. The learning objectives for this topic are: cite at least 3 characteristics that distinguish fungi from other groups of eukaryotes, list 5 ways in which fungi are beneficial, distinguish among septate hyphae, aseptate hyphae, and mycelia, describe asexual reproduction of fungi, list 3 basic types of asexual spores found in molds. Compare and contrast 3 divisions of fungi with respect to the formation of sexual spores. Describe the Deuteromycetes and explain why this group no longer constitutes a formal taxon. List several beneficial roles or functions of lichens. In this topic, we're going to talk about general characteristics of fungi and the classification of fungi. First, under the heading of general characteristics, we're going to discuss the significance of fungi, their morphology or shape, nutrition, and reproduction. Fungi are highly significant. They do a lot of good things for us. For example, because of their ability to ferment, they make bread and alcoholic beverages. Also, we can eat their fruiting body straight. Anybody who's had mushrooms on a pizza, you have fungi to thank. And also, in the environment, they break down large macromolecules that other organisms can't. They're one of the few organisms that can break down cellulose, for example. They can also break down jet fuel. They take up radioactivity, so we're looking at using them for environmental cleanup. Because fungi can eat just about anything, they also have deleterious effects. They're involved in food spoilage and also some pathology, although usually they're more likely to be the causes of plant diseases than animal diseases, although anybody who's had athlete's foot knows how annoying those can be. As far as shape, you're all familiar with mushrooms, which is a macromolecule or macro form of fungi, but we're going to talk about the shape and composition of fungal cells in more detail. First off, let's talk about chitin. Here is the molecular formula of cellulose, and chitin is basically modified cellulose. We have N-acetyl groups added to this carbon, and that's what chitin is composed of. And this is an important macromolecule in the cell wall of fungi. The body of a fungus is called a thallus, or if there's more than one, thalli. Thalli can come in 2 forms. If they are single-celled, then we generally call the fungus a yeast. If they are multicellular, then we call that a mold. Now, with the multicellular filamentous thalli of molds, we call these thread-like structures hyphae, and they can tangle with each other until they form a structure that we can see with our naked eyes, which we call a mycelium. Now, all fungi, because they have a cell wall, have absorption nutrition. In other words, they send out enzymes into the environment, breaks down macromolecules, and then it is brought back through the cell wall and the cell membrane. Also, molds are characterized by growing in a radial fashion. So if a spore lands here, then the hyphae of the thallus will radiate out from that central area. Also, most fungi are aerobic, although some yeasts are facultative anaerobes. All fungi can reproduce asexually, in other words, having a parent cell divide mitotically, and there are 4 different ways of asexual reproduction that we're going to cover here. One is to produce sporangiospores. You have a sporangium that forms. It's kind of a sac, and the spores are inside. Now, some fungi form chlamydiospores, which are thick-walled spores that form inside of the hyphae. Then there are condidospores, which are, you form condidia, and the spores form on the end of the hyphae. And then there's budding, which we've talked about before. Some fungi are able to undergo sexual reproduction, in which gametes fuse to form a diploid individual, a genetically new individual. This figure shows in general how fungi reproduce sexually. As we talk about the classification of fungi, we'll talk about various reproductive strategies and lifestyles that we use to classify the fungi into different groups. In the meantime, let's look at this figure. So, with the haploid individual, it will undergo mitosis and produce gametes. Now, they're not boys and girls, they're just different genetically. These spores will grow, the positive and the negative. When they come close together, the tips will fuse, and the cells will fuse, and you will get a cell with two haploid nuclei. We call this a dikaryon. This can exist for several years or just a few minutes, depending upon the type of fungi. And sometimes the dikaryon will undergo mitosis, maintaining those two separate nuclei. Eventually, the nuclei will fuse, forming a diploid individual. This diploid individual will undergo mitosis to create more cells, and then at the tip, the cells will undergo meiosis to produce a new haploid individual, and the spores are released. Next, we're going to talk about the classification of fungi. We're going to talk about the zygomycota, the ascomycota, the basidiomycota, deuteromycetes, and at the end we're going to talk about lichens, which are combinations of fungi with photosynthetic cells. First up, zygomycota. The example organism would be Rhizopus nigericans, and it's black bread mold, but it also affects fruit, and it reproduces asexually through the use of sporangia, and that's part of how we identify them. There is a life cycle of the average zygomycota. Most of their life is spent in asexual reproduction. You get a spore that germinates to produce mycelia. It grows, they produce sporangiopores, which produce sporangiospores. All of these have one copy of the genetics in their, one copy of the genome in their nucleus, so they're haploid. Now, sometimes two individual mycelia will contact, and they will recognize themselves as genetically distinct. If you have a mycelia growing and it's huge, sometimes you can come back around and meet yourself, and you don't want to mate with yourself. So when two different individuals meet, gametes will form, and they will fuse to form a dikaryon. Now this dikaryon, the two haploid nuclei, will fuse to form a zygosporangium. Now this forms a matured zygosporangia, which is highly resistant. It helps the mold survive bad conditions, drying, lack of food, whatever. Now, eventually, when conditions improve, meiosis will occur, and the organism will go back to being haploid and produce an asexual sporangium, which is haploid, and it will release these spores, and it will go back into the asexual reproduction. Next up, ascomycota. Morels are probably the most famous example of the ascomycota. They're delicious mushrooms. But penicillium is also an ascomycota. Later on, when we talk about the deuteromycetes, we will find that penicillium used to be considered a deuteromycetes, but because of genetic analysis, we find that it is actually an ascomycota. But penicillium is unable to reproduce sexually, whereas the other ascomycota do reproduce sexually, which is why they were put in that group originally. This figure shows the sexual and asexual life cycles of ascomycota. So we can have an ascospore, which is haploid, undergo mitosis to produce mycelia. Occasionally the mycelia will produce a condidopore, which produces condidiospores, which enables this organism to spread. Now, when two genetically different individuals meet, now we mark them as just plus and negative just to show that they're different, the cells on the end will fuse, forming a dikaryon. Now, in ascomycota, the dikaryon will undergo mitosis, maintaining the two separate haploid nuclei. until we get to the formation of an ascus, in which case the nuclei will fuse to form 2N nuclei. These 2N nuclei will undergo meiosis to form 4 spores, 4 haploid cells. These haploid cells form ascospores, they're released, and they form another individual. Most ascomycota can undergo both sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, but some members of ascomycota, like Penicillium, have lost the ability to undergo sexual reproduction, and so they are limited to asexual reproduction. Next up, Basidiomycota. Basidiomycota, most of them are mushrooms that you're familiar with. Some of them form very interesting shapes, like this lovely bird's nest fungi. Basidiomycota are different in that they don't have a real extensive asexual life cycle. The basidiospores germinate to form mycelia, and they form mycelia that are underneath the ground. But when 2 different individuals meet, the tips will fuse. This is sounding familiar, doesn't it? And form a dikaryon. This dikaryon, which kind of is diploid, but not really, you've got 2 haploid nuclei, they will undergo mitosis to form a mycelium that we can see, and a fruiting body will form. Within the fruiting body, we have the basidium, which they look like little clubs, and the dikaryons will fuse to form a true diploid individual, and then immediately undergo meiosis to form 4 haploid individuals. These basidiospores are released and form a new individual. That's how most of your mushrooms reproduce. Now, it used to be, before we were able to do genetic analysis on the 18S, our ribosome, any fungus that didn't have a sexual stage was put in the group Deuteromycetes. That includes Penicillium. Makes sense. When we're classifying the organisms by their sexual structures, then if you don't have a sexual structure, then we just put you all together. It is now a defunct designation because we're able to look at the actual genetics, and the Deuteromycetes are being moved into one of the other groups, depending upon how closely related they are. So far, most of the Deuteromycetes have been moved into Ascomycota. Now, fungi are vital in the environment because they recycle nutrients, they're delicious, they form symbiotic relationships with plants, and they are also a part of lichens, which are important for soil development. You'll see them on the side of lava rocks. If you're driving along the side of the highway, if you see splotches of color, those are lichens. So, lichens are a symbiotic association between a fungus and a photosynthetic cell. Most of the time it's a green algae cell, sometimes it's a cyanobacterium, and most of the time the fungus is in the Ascomycota. They work together. The photosynthetic cell produces sugars through photosynthesis. The fungi keep the cell protected from too much sunlight. I know that sounds like an oxymoron to say that if you're photosynthesizing you can get too much sunlight, but you can. It also keeps them moist and supplies them from minerals, because fungi are wonderful at leaching minerals out of rocks. They release acids, break down the rocks, bring in all sorts of good minerals like iron and magnesium and calcium and you name it. So they work together in this symbiotic relationship. Now, there are 3 basic shapes. I'll leave you to look those up in the book. Basically, they're flat, leaf-like, and fruit-like, with the Latin terms. Now, they can reproduce either individually, with the fungus producing, in this case, ascospores, which would go off and then just randomly associate with a phototrophic cell. Sometimes you can break off both the fungi and the photosynthetic cell in a soridium, sort of transplanting the whole lichen. That's it for the fungi. Here is a table that summarizes them. I didn't spend as much time on the fungi as I did the protozoa because they're more similar. And here are the reminders of what you need to learn from this section.